Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran in Surah Baqarah ayat number 183, He says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu kutiba alaykumus siyamu kama kutiba alal lazina min qablikum la'allakum tattaqun. He says, O you who believe, fasting is prescribed for you as it has been prescribed for those who were before you, so that you can attain piety. Piety means fear or taqwa. Now the question becomes, right, Allah is prescribing fast, which is He's prescribing fasting in the month of Ramadan. So the question becomes is, what does actual fasting teach us in the holy month of Ramadan? What is it actually teaching us, right? That's the first question to ask. The second question to ask is, if there is a spiritual connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then what do we need to do as Muslims to increase that spiritual connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the month of Ramadan? Now, the other question also is, why pick the month of Ramadan? Allah says it's the month of Ramadan, but why the month of Ramadan in particular, right? Why that particular month only, right? So we need to ask that question, why is that month also talked about? And then the other two secondary questions is, it's prescribed fasting. So part of fasting is abstaining from food and drinks, right? But then there's also a period where we are allowed to eat food and drink. But what are the types of food and drinks we should be eating and drinking during the time we are allowed to fast, right, versus the time we are not allowed to eat? So we have to ask the question, right, what type of food and drinks we should be eating even on the time we are allowed to eat fast, so that you don't nullify the effect or the benefit of the fasting you're going to get from a spiritual and physical perspective. And then the one of the more interesting questions that popped up recently was the sighting of the moon, right? And we had some individuals claim that, well, the moon we're looking at on that was the first night of Ramadan for us looked like the second night moon. So then what is the actual ruling around what exactly that means? Now, interestingly, in my house, right, the topic of the month of Ramadan and the moon sighting and always becomes an issue because, there's actually 4 people. Maybe you can count my mother too, right? Because for her birthday, there's actually 5 people who are born in the month of Ramadan itself. So we always has this question of, what is your birthday month? And then my children are little, so they always get confused between what type of calendar systems we are using, because we're used to a solar calendar system, right? And then now you come in with this lunar calendar system, and then we can't establish which one was the first day, because then that establishes what the birth date. And it's the same question that comes to us too, right? What is the month of, when does the month of Ramadan actually start? So Shaban's end of the month is also a critical. Then the 2 Eids show up, right? So you have the Eid al-Fitr. So then we have conversations around that. We have different times people are doing different Eids, right? And then so we have that conversation. You have a whole another sect of people following the astrological calculation type calendars, and then yet we are looking at sighting, and we also can agree on when exactly did we actually sight the moon to actually have the firm date on when exactly is the month of Ramadan. So this becomes a very interesting question, right, from all perspectives, whether it's for Eid, whether it's for Muharram, right, and certain significant dates, because we have a lot of religious significance to certain dates that apply in the Islamic calendar, which comes with certain rituals and festivals and things we have to do. So it becomes important to understand why this calendar month is there. So before we go there, right, we need to understand what are the types of calendar systems that are out there. So first is what we known as the solar calendar. So that's called the Gregorian calendar, right? Now, and then, so it's the solar calendar, which is pretty much in sync with the rotation of the earth around the sun. So it's an independent system, and it's trying to match up with the seasons of the year. So that's kind of the whole thing. Now, on the other hand, the lunar calendar that we use in Islam has no correlation to that solar calendar altogether, because it's more to do with the rotation of the moon around the earth. So we have a completely different independent system which is being used as a calendar system. Now, before the Gregorian calendar, there was something called as a Julian calendar. Now, Julian calendar was put in the year 46 BC by Julius Caesar. And at that time, they were actually using a lunar calendar. But as you know, with a lunar calendar, you'll always get a difference of 11 days every year. So every 3-4 years, you have to go in and artificially add an extra month to adjust to the seasons of the year. So people were playing games with that. So he decided, saying, we are going to put a new system in place where it will be 365 days that we will use. And in the year 46 BC, they actually had a year that had 445 days to catch up with everything, all the errors they had. And from there on, they said 365 days divide by 12. So that was the system they were using. Now, however, as you know, 365 is not exactly 365. There's another quarter extra day in there. So they said we will introduce the concept of what is called as a leap year, right? So in a leap year, what they said is that every 4 years in the month of February, we will add an extra day to the calendar. So that was the system that was designed by basically the Julian calendar or Julius Caesar. Now, however, the problem with that type of calendar system is that it's actually not completely 365.25. It's actually 365.2425. So it's not exactly a quarter. So every 128 years, the calendar would drift by a day. So by the time they reached the 16th century, right, in the time, so that's where the Gregorian calendar came in. And they found out that over a 1600 year period from the year 46 BC to 1582 AD, they had drifted by 11 days. So 21st March, which should have been the first day of spring, their calendar said that the 21st March or the first day of spring was 11th of March because it had shifted by 11 days on top of it. So what they said is like, okay, we need to introduce another correction to the calendar. So they went and skipped 10 days on the calendar to catch it back up again. And then they said that we will do is a system where if a year is divisible by 100, but not divisible by 400, and I'm being a little bit technical, so I'm just going to explain it simply, right? So, for example, the year 2000 would have had a leap year because it's every 4 years. February would be a leap year. However, the year 2100 is not going to be a leap year because it's not divisible by 400. So they basically figured out a way to mathematically adjust that calendar system. So that was the part with Pope Gregory. So that's why it's called the Gregorian system. Now that system started, so it was only in late 1600s, so it wasn't like long ago. And it's only in the 18th and 19th century when that calendar started being used by everybody across the globe from a civil perspective. So that's what people started using. Now, and that's still being used and then the old calendar, which was the calendar which was used before the Julian calendar, still used by old Orthodox Church, Christian Orthodox Church, to establish religious festivals. So they do that. Now the problem with the Islamic lunar month is that it begins with the sighting of the new moon, right? And an average lunar month is actually 29 and a half days. It's not exactly 29 days, and it's not exactly 30 days. It's something in between, which is where it causes some of the confusion regarding when do you see it, because there's a half day exactly in between. Now, the problem with that is that then that makes the Islamic calendar 354 days versus the 365 days. So now you have a gap of 11 days every year. Now, so what happens is that these 11 days keep shifting, and over a 33-year period, both the calendars come back in alignment all over again. Or you could introduce what the Romans were doing, was put an artificial month in between every 3-4 years to adjust the calendar. So that kind of, that is actually not allowed in Islam, to artificially put in an extra month in there. So we basically have 354 days. So what's happening is, as you look at it, previously, I think in 2019, it was somewhere 2017, 2018, it was like June, July was where Ramadan was, and now you're seeing it's in March. So that calendar is steadily moving over the number of years. So the Islamic calendar basically moves across the whole, Gregorian calendar or the solar calendar over the entire 33-year period until it finally catches back up again. Now, the issue we have is that, there is the new moon, right? And the new moon is basically when the moon is between the earth and the sun, where we cannot see the side of the moon facing the earth. It's completely invisible or dark. Now, however, that's not where our calendar starts. Our calendar starts with when we see the crescent, the visible crescent of the moon after the new moon. So when we start seeing the crescent is when we start counting our Islamic calendar as the first day of the month. Now, the problem with that is that when we say visible seeing of the crescent, right, it actually is dependent on a lot of factors. It's dependent on where the angular placement of the moon is with compared to the sun in the sky. That's number one issue, right? Number two issue is that, where exactly is it in the horizon. Sometimes it can be even below the horizon, sometimes it can be above the horizon. So it's not only that, right? It's the angle with the sun and the moon, and then where it is in the sky relative to us. And then the third is visibility factor. You can see today, for example, right? It's cloudy, so you can't see it, period, right? You would miss it. So that would be the conversation. Now, the conversation starts with our marja on some of these certain topics in this style. So number one question comes is, do we see it with the naked eye, or can we use a telescope? Right? That's the first conversation, right? Can you see it with a telescope? Are you allowed to see it with a telescope, right? And then, and then there's different rulings with different marja on different types of things that can happen. So according to Ayatollah Sistani, it has to be seen with the naked eye. You cannot use an optical aid, and that sighting has to be in your local area. So for example, if it happens in this city and maybe Indianapolis is next door, you have a natural tendency of being able to see there. So that's kind of called a local area per se, right? Now, and that requires unaided visual confirmation. That's the exact word. You can't use a telescope to see it, you have to be able to see it. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei comes in and he says, well, wait a second, like if you can see it with a telescope, we'll count it. So if you can watch it with, I think somebody came here a couple of years ago, I can fly. So he said, let's just go take the plane, we'll go up there and, we can go above the clouds and look at it, and that can get counted because you can see the crescent. So that's called aided guide, right? The Ayatollah Sayyid Khoi, right? He says you can do this sighting, but you can basically, so the earlier two said local area. Ayatollah Sayyid Khoi comes in and he says, by the way, anytime we have a shared night, if you have a shared night, you're good. You can count it. If it's the same night, like if I'm at 7 p.m. here and everybody before me has a night, right? Because towards the east, there would be night there, right? So anybody towards my east who would have a shared night, you can count it, right? Because they have the night time, right? Or even a little bit ahead, right? Where we might sight the moon at a certain time at night, and if they have a shared night, you can count it. Now, there's another one where Sheikh Bashir comes in and he says, well, basically, if you see the moon anywhere in the world, doesn't matter, you can count it. Now, however, that opinion is less used these days, right? But there was another opinion out there that if you see anywhere on the earth, you sight the moon, you're good. Eid is everywhere around the world. So, we have to go back and ask the question on why certain Maharaja are using certain criteria, right? Because that gives us an idea to answer why the moon is being declared a certain way. So the most famous is our Ayatollah Sistani. So I'll just give you a little bit idea about how he is looking at the moon sighting, right? So it just gives you an idea about it, right? So the first is, what cannot be counted. So testimony of women cannot be counted, however many women they are, right? And by the way, if they can even take an oath, doesn't matter, I'm sorry, right? But that's the ruling, right? The second one is one man cannot be counted. So even if it's an adil man, he's just, he's truthful, if one man looks at it, you can't count it, right? That's not counted. Now, You also cannot use, that question is like, technologies advanced so much, why don't we just use a calculation, right? So then the problem is that the calculations is not exactly correct, because the orbit of the moon around the earth is not exactly in a circular fashion. It's actually elliptical, where, and the moon goes further out and comes back further in each circle. So it's not like completely a same orbit either. The moon actually travels far back out and comes back close and goes far back, even in elliptical orbit. So we don't, so according to Ayatollah Sistani, we don't use calculations. So that's prohibited. So you cannot use calculation for using. So that was a question, right? If our Sunni brothers can use the calculator and calculate it, why don't we do it? So that according to his ruling, you can't, right? The other thing is, if you see the moon after Fajr, like the dawn, right? If you see the moon after Fajr, you cannot count it for the night before and say that was the first night of it. So if you count it during the Fajr time, now it's Fajr, right? But it's not sunlight yet, but it's Fajr. You see, it's Fajr. You can't count it as the previous day. There's also the conversation that if two just, so I said one witness. Now, if two just people show up and they say we heard from somebody that they saw the moon, that's also not counted, right? You cannot have indirect reports. You have to actually physically see the moon. So two people, right? Two adil people, right? Just people have to actually see the moon. Also, the other issue is that if you see the moon from, like, for example, what happened with us, for example, right? It looked a little bit more brighter, right? And what happened is that the moon showed up somewhere before, for example, Zohar. So now it's not Fajr, but somewhere around Zohar time, and somebody saw it. That's also not, you cannot retro back and go back that day is the first day of the month. Actually, has to go back to the next night. So that just gives you some idea around how. Now, why is, the question becomes is, why is Ayatollah Sistani insisting on this matter? So number one point is that he is going on the basis of certainty and accuracy. So I'm emphasizing the word certainty. Certainty means you have to see it in that certain window time frame. If you don't see it in that window time frame, then you cannot count that day as being the first day of the month. Any observance actually takes it to the next day. So that's the first conversation, right? So that gives you, so it basically is a cautious approach, right? Meaning you have, and the thing is, the reason he's using the cautious approach is because a lot of the holy festivals or religious rituals are all tied with the sighting of the moon. So you don't want to be just winging it, for example. So you have to make sure that you are certain about the visibility of the moon. So that just gives you an idea that, he's using what he's saying is a certainty method, that you have to be for sure, and you have to for sure see it. Somebody actually has to see it unless it's the 30th, then you can count it. But other than that, you have to for sure see it. Now, the question becomes is, why can't we have a ruling where everybody says we're going to follow this one marja and we're going to have Eid across the board as everybody together? So that's also a question that pops up all the time, right? So there, the question is that the sighting of the moon criteria is what is used as called as an ijtihadi method, meaning a reasoning method. And when they're doing a reasoning method, meaning they are extrapolating the studies from the Quran and the Hadith, right? And then they are coming to a conclusion on this is how we should actually do it. Now, the problem with that is that when you do ijtihadi method, which means a scholarly interpretation of a certain ruling, right? It's very difficult to impose it on everybody, right? Especially in our Shia culture, right? We have taqlees that people do of different marja, so they have slightly different rulings. So you can't say just Sistani's ruling everybody follow, because that's contrary to the method of ijtihad, right? The ijtihad really means that you have the choice to follow whosoever you're trying to follow and his methodology and ruling, right? That's number one. Also, the other question is, a lot of local communities, and there's so much diversity. Even if you look at Cincinnati, you can see the amount of Muslim community, that is the diverse community that is present today. So if you just say we're going to use one method and everybody follow one method, you're going to oppress somebody else's community, and you're going to, and where you're going to start? You're going to start with the moon, then you might say let's do another thing, then let's do another thing. So it becomes a problem, especially on something that is using scholarly interpretation versus something you're very sure about. So that's the other question, right? So that gives you just some idea around where this whole thing is going. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wala sarinal insana lafi khusrin illa allazina amanu wa amilus salihati wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Inna Allaha malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi ya ayyuhallazina amanu sallu alayhi wa sallimu taslima. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina bil Qasim Mustafa Muhammad. وعلى آله الأطيبين الأطهرين المنتجبين الهداة المهديين المعصومين وصل على علي أمير المؤمنين وفاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين والحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة وعلي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والخلف القائم المهدي صلواتك عليهم أجمعين. وصل على أئمة المسلمين وهمات المستضيفين وهداة المؤمنين صلوات. So Allah says in Surah Baqarah ayat number 168, He says, Ya ayyuhan nasu kulu mimma ardil halalin tayyiba. He says, O people, eat of whatever in the earth that is good, permissible, halal and good, tayyib, halal and tayyib. Now the problem is that, on one hand, Allah doesn't say don't go eat haram, right? He's saying eat halal and eat pure, good food. However, our conversations always go switch to, we're always worrying about what is haram versus worrying about what is pure and good food, right? So that's one tendency, right, to do this. And Allah says, if you eat, haram food, then it opens up shaitan, it opens you up to actually being, influenced by the shaitan, for example, right? So a little bit about, what types of food are halal and haram, right? And what is tayyib food, right? To just give you an idea. So number one, vegetables, fruit, grains, all are halal. That's simple conversation, right? Number two, sea creatures. So sea creatures, all non-fish. I'm talking about pure Shia fiqh, right? So don't take me out of context somewhere else, right? All non-fish are haram. Like, and then fish, for example, fish that have scales, and that includes shrimp and prawn, are halal. Fish, and fish that have skin, they are haram. So that just gives you an idea, right? And for example, non-fish animals could be, like squid, lobster, clams, frogs. They're all haram, right? Because they are non-fish animals, right? And the only condition with the fish is that it must be fished out alive at the time of fishing out. That's the condition, right? For it doesn't have to be a Muslim. Land creatures, right? Animals are generally haram, except the ones that are allowed, right? And they're also, in that case, domesticated animals are halal only if they are slaughtered based on the zabiha method, right? In the case of wild halal animals, right, their meat is halal when they are hunted by a Muslim who says Bismillah at the time of shooting. So that's just gives you an idea. Which animals are haram or halal? Are cow, sheep, goat, camel, right? Animals like a horse, donkey, or mule is actually makruh, but it's still halal, by the way. And then wild animals would be buffalo, mountain sheep, gazelle, deer. Those are all halal animals. Everything except that is actually haram, right? Gives you an idea there. Now, how about birds? All birds are halal except birds that prey on other animals. right? So that's one. Birds that glide more than flapping their wings. So that would be, right? And they're permissible only if they are slaughtered halal way, right? So that's another condition, right? Eggs of halal bird are halal. Eggs of haram birds are haram. That just gives you a simple way to do it. We also get into conversations, right? There's so many restaurants and choices where we go eat food. So what is the criteria there? How do we look at it? So when it comes to vegetarian food, anything that is an Ahlul Kitab, meaning it's a Christian or Jew, it's halal, right? That's not a problem. I'm talking vegetarian food, right? On non-Muslims also, so now you're not talking about Christian or Jew, right? So non-Muslim, right? If a non-Muslim has physical contact, that's also okay. The only condition, it shouldn't be wetness. There shouldn't be a wet touch to the food. You can touch the food as long as it's dry, it's fine. But the wet touchness, so if they touch it when it's wet, then it becomes najis, right? So it's haram. Otherwise, it's okay. Packed vegetarian food, you don't have to question. It's halal. So there's no confusion there, right? Meat products. So that's another. That's where and basically, to be honest with you, majority of the time the halal or haram conversation really becomes tricky only especially when it comes to meat. So that's where you have to be a lot more careful than the other items, right? So if you buy or receive food containing meat from any non-Muslim, that is actually haram. Now I'm going basically on the rulings, right? So don't go quote me, right? I'm telling you what exactly is in there, right? Similarly, if you buy or receive food containing meat from a Muslim, but his supplier is non-Muslim, or if he has not verified that it was zabiha food, then it's haram. So even if you get it from a Muslim, and if his supplier is non-Muslim and he's not confirming it's zabiha or not, it's haram. However, right, a Muslim can buy and receive meat from a Muslim market where it's halal, and you don't have to do any further inquiry. So you don't have to go specifically ask, right? If you're invited to a Muslim's home, right, and you're served food, meat, right, it's against etiquette to actually ask, is this zabiha food? Because your assumption should be that it is actually zabiha food. So if you go to a Muslim and if they're serving meat, you shouldn't be questioning them about whether it's halal or haram. So that gives you a good idea there, right? Now, drinking any type of intoxicating drink is haram. So if you have any drink that intoxicates you, so that means any kind of beer, wine, any alcoholic drink is all haram, right? And then this applies to any drinks, even if it's a drop. So any drink that is intoxicating, even if it's a drop, it's haram, right? Grape drink is also haram, even if it's if it's heated or fermented. I read somewhere that if it's 2/3 evaporated, then you can drink it, but you can go verify it, right? Raisin drink, that is halal, right? So date or raisin drink is halal, right? The food must be done by zabiha, right? So that's fine, right? The halal meat should be zabiha, so that there's a whole criteria around what it should be. It can be a non-Muslim, it can be a non-Shia also. As long as a Muslim, it's fine, right? I think I read in there somewhere that it cannot be a non-Muslim, right? However, I will check that and confirm it to you. I just want to go back to the part about halal and tayyib food, because that's really where the conversation goes. So I'm going to quote from Najul Balaga, Imam Ali alayhi salam, salawat. I know I'm talking about food and we are fasting, right? So that's interesting itself, right? So Imam Ali says there is no better form of self-control than like that of restraint in a doubtful situation. So if you're in doubt, you need to practice self-restraint. It may look good, taste good, but if you have a doubt or a question mark, then you should avoid it. That's Imam Ali's hadith, Najul Balaga, sermon number 113. And then he says, so this is the part I'm going to emphasize. This is so interesting, right? He's praising one of his fellow companions. So Imam Ali is praising one of his fellow companions regarding his food habits. So pay attention to these words. There's so much deep meaning in just these couple of sentences. He says, I had a brother in faith. So Imam Ali is talking about this person. He says he was free from the control of his stomach. He was free. What's Ramadan teaching us? Control of our stomach, right? So Imam Ali says this person was free from the control of his stomach. And he says if two options were presented to this person, right, he would see which was closest to his desire. So he would look at both of the foods and say, oh man, I like this biryani, right? Correct? And he would literally judge that. And then then he would oppose it. So whatever he liked, he actually would not eat it. It's a very interesting concept, right? I just went for iftar yesterday. And then, I went there. And here you're coming from fasting, right? And then you had the pre-snacks. You had the bhajia and the pakora, and the first there was a pre-snack, right? Then they went to pray. Then they came back, and there were 6 different dishes, right, which had all kinds of oil and meat, and there's not one vegetable dish, by the way, in there. I'm standing here, so I remember very clearly. And so then you start to ask the question, right? We fasted the whole day, right? And then when it came down to putting good food in our stomach, right, what did we actually do? So whatever benefit you had gained from that 14 hours, 15 hours of fasting, guess what you just did? You just undid the whole thing. This is just me giving advice from that perspective, right? That it's so interesting to note, and inshallah we will have iftar too, so if somebody is listening they can probably look at it that way, right? But feeding good tayyib food, pure food, right? There's an interesting story, right? Nabi Musa was taking the Israelites across the desert, right? And here you had this man and salwa. You've heard man and salwa, right? Manna was in the morning, right? Winds would blow, and they would have these grains that would, blow the winds. When winds blow seeds, right? Because they can blow seeds from. So these seeds would blow in, and they would collect on these trees, and they tasted like honey, and it was seeds. So they would use the seeds to make bread. And so that's what they would eat for breakfast. So that was in the morning. And in the evening, you had these quails, salwa, right? That would come, and they would grab these quail and they would eat it. Now, quail are known as being, low fat. So if you think about it, what are they eating in the morning? They're eating, glucose, carbohydrates, fiber, right? And vitamins, for example. And then in the evening, they're eating protein and amino acids, right? Balanced diet. So they went to Nabi Musa and said, hey, Nabi Musa, right? He says, what's going on? He says, we want vegetables. We want stuff that grows from the ground. We want the cucumbers and the potatoes, and we want the spices, and we want wheat. And Nabi Musa says, would you sacrifice, right, for something that is worse for you, for something that is good for you, right? So he's basically criticizing them that you're actually getting good tayyib food that is actually good for you, but you want the taste part, and you're ruining what is supposed to be a good appetite. So this is again just advice from you from a perspective that the month of Ramadan, at least in my humble view, is that Allah is asking you to fast because your body gets purified. So when your body becomes purified, your soul becomes receptive to receive the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you just go and indulge at the end of the fast into the same thing all over again, you just undid whatever purification your body went to get the spiritual communication with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it just gives you an idea about what type of food habits to actually have. If you want to have good physical benefits, I'm going to give you some examples, right? There's a person who's an alcoholic, for example, right? And they drink alcohol for 20 years. Right? And then all of a sudden they realize they're making a mistake, and they do istighfar and with sincere apology and apologize to Allah, and Allah forgives them. All done, clean, right? Because you can apologize till the day of judgment. Now that's fine, that person is good there, right? But what happens to his liver for the 20 years that he exposed? Your body is your amana from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You've been given this gift from Allah, and we don't possess anything in this world we don't possess. It's not ours. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's gift to us. So if Allah is giving this gift to you, what are you doing with this gift? Right? Because he's going to take account for it on the day of judgment. He'll say, like, look, I gave you this wonderful body, right, to use, and you abused it by smoking or drinking or doing any of the bad habits, right? So that just go, and the thing, the problem is that, it causes, there'll be punishment that Allah will take account for on the day of judgment, right? Not only that, it causes illness and disease. Nowadays, you can see some of these effects, right? You can, obesity, and then it causes diabetes and blood sugar. You may clean up your habits at that point, but guess what? It's too late at that point. Now you got to work on curing it or sustaining it. Versus if you had worked on it before, maybe you had prolonged that sickness or illness. So that just tells you about, good food habits, right? Now let's talk a little bit about the spiritual part. I don't know how much time I have left. Rasulullah says in his khutbah Shabaniya, he says, Ayyuhan nas, innahu qad aqbala ilaykum shahrullahi bil barakati wa rahmati wa maghfirat. So he says, oh people, right? Allah's month has come to you with blessings, mercy, and forgiveness. So it is a month where barakat, rahmah, and maghfirat are all coming because you've been invited to this month, right? And it is in the month, in Allah's eyes, it is the best of the months. Ramadan's months are the best of the months, and its days are the best of the days. And then he goes and says its nights are the best of the nights, and its hours are the best of the hours. And then he continues, he says, it is a month in which you have been invited to Allah's hospitality. So we are guests of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this month. Think of this way, right? Somebody gives you a dawat to an invitation to come eat food at their home. What is the first thing they're doing? It's a personal invitation, right? Because they have to invite you. Then what is the next thing? They're honoring you, right? When somebody invites you to come eat in their home with you, what are they doing? They're inviting you, right? So they're honoring you, right? When they're inviting you. Not only that, when you go there, what do you get? You get free food, right? You don't have to bring anything. You just bring yourself. And then think of this way. If I show up to your home and you are the host and you are not there when I show up, would that be rude? Yeah, it would be rude, right? So Allah is inviting us in this month, right? To His maghfirah, barakah, and His mercy. So you think when Allah is inviting you, what is He doing? He's personally inviting you. He's honoring you. He's giving you all these free gifts, right? And then what else is He doing? He's saying, I'm going to be there. If you can open yourself up spiritually to me, I will be there. I will be close to you if you want to be next to me, right? And then He says, your breathing is praise, hamd. When you breathe in the fast, it's hamd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you sleep in your fast, it's worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And your prayers will be answered. So if you do dua in this month, your prayers will be accepted. And then he continues, he says, so ask Allah with your sincerest intentions and pure hearts. Why? So that He may grant you success in fasting, and then what else? Reciting the book. Now, I've gotten into this tangential discussion every time, right? When it comes to the Quran, right? And we recite it in Surah Jummah all the time, right? And Allah gives the example of the Yahud, right? Who are carrying the Torah as workers on the back. And then He says they are like donkeys because they are carrying the book on their back without any meaning. So don't just recite the Quran. Try to establish a personal relationship with the Quran. Imam Ali says the Quran is silent, you got to make it speak. And when you make it speak, how do you make it speak? You make it speak by understanding it, trying to focus on it, trying to understand the teachings of the Quran. So Rasulullah is saying, Allah will grant you success in the reciting of His book in this month if you open up the Quran and look at it like that. And then He says, wretched is the one who is deprived of Allah's forgiveness in this great month. So you are a deprived person. You're very wretched if you are deprived of this month, right? So, and then he gives a couple of lessons. He says, remember your hunger and thirst, because this is the same type of hunger and thirst that will be there on the day of judgment. When you're going to be roaming around on the day of judgment, you're going to be standing there. You're going to be standing in hunger and thirst until your judgment is done. So this hunger and thirst that He's giving you is reminding you about the hunger and thirst that you're going to endure on the day of judgment. And it is also reminding you of the people who don't have anything. It's the people in our community, right? It's the people in our family, right? It's the people that we know, people we don't know. They don't have these blessings. We have the food. He's teaching us, you have this in front of you, don't eat it. You have this drink in front of you, don't drink it. But then he's teaching you that, you have these blessings. There are people who actually want to eat and want to drink, but they don't even have it. I remember I went to Africa, right? There's people, or India, I've seen people eat on like newspaper or, leaves of trees, right? Food, and they might get one-time meal. So Rasulullah says, give alms to your poor and needy. Do charity in this month. And then he says, honor your elders. You have to honor your elders. Have mercy on your young ones. Do rahmah on your young ones. Be kind to your relatives, silatul rahim, right? You have to have silatul rahim. A lot of times, we get angry at some of our relatives and we don't talk to them, period. And, there's a lot of hadiths out there that, if you don't have silatul rahim with your close relatives, your lifespan actually decreases. So if you have silatul rahim, meaning mercy and communication with your relatives, I know some may be bad, right? And I get it, but at least have that communication pipeline open with them, right? And then he says, guard your tongues. It's like we have those 3 statues of, they call Gandhi, right? The eyes are closed. So Rasulullah says, turn a blind eye to what is not permissible for your eyes to look at. Guard your tongue. And then he says, to what is not permissible for your ears to listen, do not listen. So stomach, right? Mouth, from an eating, drinking, but then also the way you communicate, whether you're seeing haram things or you're listening to haram things, or you're talking bad about somebody, you're doing ghibah, right? Don't do that. That's what the advice is. And then he says, be compassionate to people's orphans. So be compassionate to the people's orphans, and they will have compassion on your orphans. Eventually, every one of us is going to become an orphan at some point of time in our life, right? So he's saying, if you don't have compassion on other people's or orphans, how are other people going to have compassion on you when you become an orphan? So this is the type of advice that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is giving us in the month of Ramadan. May Allah guide us to use the khutbah and the teachings of our Rasulullah to make us successful in the month of Ramadan and accept our fast and our prayers and give us, rahmah, maghfirah, and barakat in this month. Oh Allah, we ask you for all that is good in this world in the hereafter. Oh Allah, we seek refuge with you from all evil in this world and in the hereafter. Oh Allah, we ask you for the good that your servant and prophet has asked you for. We seek refuge with you from the evil from which your servant and prophet sought refuge from. O Allah, we ask you for paradise, for that which brings one closer to it. We seek refuge in you from hell, from that and deeds that brings one closer to it. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min fitnatin nar wa azabin nar wa a'udhu bika min fitnatil qabr wa a'udhu bika min azabil qabr wa a'udhu bika min fitnatil ghina wa a'udhu bika min fitnatil qabr. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء والأموات تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك على كل شيء قدير. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.